Nemesis, winged tilter of scales and lives, justice spawned goddess with steel blue eyes. You bridal vain men who roil in vain against your adamantine reign. Great hater of hubris and megalomania, obliterator of black resentment, by your trackless, churning, racking wheel, man's glinting fortunes turn on earth. This is a famous hymn to the ancient Greek goddess Nemesis, who punished mortals who showed arrogance before the gods. And she did so with relentless energy. Once Nemesis was on your ass, it was only a matter of when, not if, that you got your just reward. And the lesson of Nemesis is an important one for those who play Dungeons and Dragons. Because as you as a player advance through the world, gaining in power, treasure, and renown, you're going to make some noise and you're going to ruffle a few feathers. And depending on how players handle their success and treat or dispense with their opponents will determine the sort of enemies that they make. They may find themselves embroiled in a conflict with a relentless, implacable foe, the arch-nemesis. Hello again, folks. KR King here, helping you homebrew your own D&D campaign. So today I'm going to be talking about creating a nemesis or group of nemeses to confront the players in your campaign. And I think nemeses are an essential component of any D&D game because they work so well within the storyline structure that makes up such a critical component of the game. A nemesis story is an ongoing one. It usually starts with an initiating incident, then you have rising action, until finally you have a conflict, the final confrontation between the players and their nemesis, resulting in the defeat of one or the other, or some kind of, resolution. And because D&D, the storylines evolve in a serial fashion, you can have the conflict with the nemesis ebb and flow. It doesn't have to just be the center of the action all the time, but that it's going towards this climax because it is a beef between the nemesis and the party, which must be resolved. And I'm going to talk about a nemesis versus the party here, and not a nemesis versus a single individual player character. And there's a couple reasons for this. In an earlier video, I talked about creating a, blood rival kind of situation with a player character based upon their background. But I feel as though that when you have something like a nemesis in a campaign, you want to create that nemesis out of the action of the players in that world. Just like a good story should be resolved from the action contained within that story, so too should a nemesis arise this way. And while a player can singularly make enemies of NPCs or monsters in their play, I would avoid having this sort of enemy rise to the status of a nemesis. Because the thing is, a nemesis is going to have some power behind it in order to back up its desire for revenge. And if you've got it directed at one player, the other players may feel like, everything is revolving around this storyline with this one player at our expense. Or the player could say, why me? I'm being, picked on by this NPC and the other player characters are ignored. And the other thing is, if a player character, makes a series of moves, that are, cause an enemy to be really ticked off, have this kind of emotional response, it's better to have it directed at the group. Why? Because the group may need to control this kind of behavior. Just as murder hobos, if players make this kind of activity, the NPCs in the world will snuff them out quickly. So too should players when someone makes these egregious sort of moves that they know this is going to tick this monster or whatever off to such a level it's going to hunt us down. They're going to tell them, do not do that. And it really helps if the NPC is after the whole group. Now there's another interesting point of order here in terms of a nemesis. You could have a god such as Nemesis herself who goes after the player characters a la, ancient Greece. I would not do this because of the unique relationship that we have with gods in terms of the storytelling and game structure as opposed to their, origins in the real world. So the Greeks believed that the gods existed, but they used their actions in a mythological sense to explain the actions and motives of human beings and, sometimes natural events. But, we know that Nemesis didn't and doesn't exist. So in D&D, the gods are real, and they do impact events in a real way, but we're playing the game. The GM and the player characters are interacting with each other under, game mechanics, under very limits based on the power of the players and whatnot to create the storyline. So it wouldn't really work if you had a group of PCs, even at the 20th level, squaring off against Nemesis herself. Let's say you're using the Greek pantheon. All right, so you're going to create a nemesis or group of nemeses that is after the entire party and is based upon the activities of the players against that, an NPC or a monster during gameplay. And those activities are going to determine whether or not the NPC or monster rises in their response to the level of a nemesis. So we usually think of a vendetta-style rivalry arising from some sort of defeat, right? The players have defeated an NPC or monster. But what changes that? Sometimes, the creatures will just accept the defeat, they'll be mad or whatever, they'll go off to their next thing, whereas others will stew and plot their revenge. So I would call this difference the emotional toll of the defeat, in which the reaction to the defeat is not in proportion to any tangible loss of either items or status or whatever. A classic emotional response to a defeat that can result in a nemesis situation is humiliation. Think about sports. If one team is clearly better and they take a big lead, and halfway through they start to put in their reserve players and they go along and they beat the team, it's a respectable loss, it's nothing out of hand. But if the winning team keeps all their starters in and they just pile on the points and they just humiliate the other team, now you've got beef. Now you've got an arch rivalry. Well, it's the same thing in D&D. If the player characters beat an NPC or monsters in a humiliating way, whether directly or, remotely or whatever, you've got grounds here for a potential nemesis response. And the thing is, this humiliation can come merely from the defeat itself. In my last video where I discussed, why monsters run away and the after effects, I used an example of a mind flayer who's defeated by a group of players and decides to use its planar shift ability to get away. Well, what is going to be its reaction to such a humiliating turn of events against lowly humanoids? Because we know in the description that mind flayers are contemptuous of all other life forms, we also know that most of them have a structure of a group, a colony of mind flayers that serves an elder brain. Well, what happens when this mind flayer goes back and has to recount this loss to these lowly humanoids? Would there be punishment associated with this loss, or simply scorn or loss of status? And how could they regain this status? Could it only be through going out, hunting down, and killing this group? Or could it even be they have to track down and ruin the lives of everyone associated with them? That would be an arch-nemesis. And you have another kind of related emotional response to this sort of defeat, which I call fury. And I think this is associated oftentimes with very intelligent and powerful sentient creatures who tend to be very narcissistic, and they sort of can't handle the idea of humiliation. So instead they channel that into their anger at the group. And that becomes a burning desire to punish. Now the thing is, suppose the mind flayer in the colony has some elaborate plan that they're trying to get into effect, and one of them is searching for something and runs into the players and it has to plane shift away, but it doesn't influence this plan or anything. Maybe they will just move along. But suppose that the activities of the players in fact impact this plan, and suppose they stop it in its tracks. The players, find some artifact the mind flayer was looking for, and they take it away and they give it to some powerful creature to protect. Now the mind flayer's plans are ruined. And this is what some people call the Scooby-Doo effect. If you remember that old TV show in which the villains at the end were always bemoaning the fact their brilliant plans were ruined, by these lowly teenagers.
Meddling young fools. They've gotten away with a king's ransom.
And notice that it's the actions of the players that determines whether or not the defeated opponent becomes a nemesis. It isn't necessarily a mistake the players make or some egregious, action they take. Simply the process of them going out into the world, defeating monsters, gathering treasure that can cause things to become very resentful. Because creatures do not like having their stuff taken or their plans ruined. And this emotional response is the key component, because many creatures, if they're defeated, will just be glad to have gotten away. They don't want to have anything more to do with that group. But the thing is, in the real world, we're all familiar that sometimes we let our emotions get the better of us. When this happens with NPC monsters, the player characters will understand this. It will justify the response, in terms of a nemesis status, as long as you've set it up that way and made it obvious that that's what's happening. So another classic emotional response to a defeat that can lead to a nemesis situation is greed. If you sneak into a dragon's lair and you steal some part of its treasure, it's going to want it back. And since dragons are notoriously greedy, even a tiny loss as compared to the size of the hoard may provoke an extreme response, an extreme desire to get this back and to punish the thieves. In any creature, if you take, a lot of its treasure or its most coveted item, it's going to have this response of wanting that item back. And you could have the item provoke this greed response. Think of the ring in Lord of the Rings, in which Gollum, kills his brother, is exiled from his whole family and tribe, and then when it was taken away from him, he risks going into Mordor to search it, and in the end is annihilated, all for his greed of this item. And when you have a sentient item, you have a symbiotic relationship between that item and the user, such that if it's taken away, the user may have a jealousy response. It's as though you stole away a loved one. Helen of Troy created an army of nemeses, which ended up, destroying Troy and razing it to the ground, salting the earth. And jealousy, envy is an emotional response that can build over time. It kind of works well with the serial nature of the storytelling in D&D. If you have a group of NPCs who are competing with your player characters, and then over time they have the same objectives, looking for the same items and whatnot, and as tends to happen in D&D, the players get the best of them, they can start to become very jealous, they can start to become nemesis. And this is using the storytelling nature of D&D to its greatest advantage. You can also have a very strong emotional reaction with NPCs and monsters to an indirect defeat. That is, the players didn't just directly, beat them in battle or whatnot, but it has some effect on them. Let's say a group of orcs is harassing a village and the players hunt them down and they kill all the orcs. Case closed? I don't think so, because even if none of the orcs escaped to go back to their village to warn tell the rest of the tribe what happened, the tribe is going to say, well, where did our patrol go? And they're going to hunt and see if they can figure out what happened. But again, it's the emotional import of this defeat that's going to determine whether, there is some response, whether it gets to the level of a nemesis response. So if the orcs are, rogue orcs, they were told not to harass these villagers because the orcs have other plans. They're involved in other things. They'll go back. They might search for a day or two to see who did this, but otherwise they're just going to move on. But if the players killed an important orc, let's say the son or brother of the chieftain, they're going to spend a little more time. They're going to, spend some, week or so to try to find who killed the son. And you can complicate this a little further. Presumably, female orcs fight alongside male orcs. I mean, female characters play in D&D, so why not? Well, what if you have, the partner of the chief of the tribe, whether it's male or female, doesn't matter, and they're killed? Or if it's a female, what if it's the pregnant, wife of the chieftain, and now he's out to kill the person that killed his sire? Now, you got to be careful here, because if you're going to have a pregnant orc, are you going to let the players see that, hey, that you notice one of these orcs is pregnant, such that they could say, well, we're not going to kill her, we'll just knock her out or disable her, whatever? Because if it comes down, these orcs are just on this bloodlust, nemesis-style retribution thing, and it's because they killed a pregnant orc and you didn't tell them, they're going to be like, really? Could be a screw job. And there can be emotional responses. Let's say a group of characters sneaks in and steals something from some NPCs, a chest of gold. They're going to be pissed, they're going to look for it, whatever. But they may just take that as part of the thing of, they better be more secure or whatever because they've got more important things to do. But suppose that, this treasure is a treasure map that this NPC took 10 years to find. And it's to this lost temple with this great treasure. Oh, they're going to look for that. And they're going to punish whoever took it. All right, so we defined some of the actions that player characters can take in-game to provoke a potential nemesis response. Then we've talked about the emotional states that can take, a defeat, take it from just, they're mad about the defeat or whatever, to arch-nemesis. The next question is, how does a nemesis response differ in terms of the different creatures and NPCs based on intelligence and whatnot? And what sort of actions might they take to get their revenge? Whether it's a direct response immediately or over time. Because, of course, revenge is a dish served best cold. So that'll be my next video. In the meantime, if you like what you've seen, please subscribe to my channel because I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments. I love to read them and to answer them. But most importantly, my friends, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.